Hello, LinkedIn friends. Thank you for joining us for our inaugural Frasco and Friends live discussion. Today, you'll have the opportunity to gain some pearls of wisdom from two very experienced risk, claims, and safety professionals. We're joined by Joelle and Cade, who have worked with global and national programs overseeing work comp, general liability, and premises claims. We're so happy to have you here today, guys. Joel and Cade, please tell our viewers a little bit about who you are and your current role. Let's start with Cade.
Thank you, Angel. Who am I? I reside in North Potomac, Maryland with my wife and 2-month-old son. From a career perspective, I began my career as an independent adjuster and investigator before transitioning to Marriott International's self-insured, self-administered claims team, which is known as Marriott Claims Services. And then most recently, during the pandemic, I was hired by Marriott Vacations Worldwide, also known as MVW, where I currently serve as the Director of Global Claims and oversee our property, liability, and EPL claims programs.
Wonderful. Happy to have you.
Thank you.
Joelle, my friend, how about you?
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So I currently work for the San Francisco Giants. I am the Director of Risk Management and Compliance. So what that all means, I manage all the risk, safety, compliance, and insurance programs for the organization. Prior to that, I worked in tech over at Uber and dabbled in risk management at a few other organizations. However, my start for the career was on that claims desk handling workers' comp claims in California. So born and bred claims person. Hopefully we have some claims people here so you can hear some of the things that we're doing on the risk side since we're all part of the ecosystem together.
I love that you use that word ecosystem because it's so true. Claims professionals, they are the baked in, that's kind of the heart of what we do in our industry. And you and I have both kind of transitioned over into risk, so many different places to go. So thank you for introducing yourself. And our topic today, LinkedIn, is program mitigation. We know that claims and risk programs are high dollar liability for companies. I mean, that is a huge amount of where our money goes when we're talking about what it costs on an annual basis just to have our insurance in all of these different lines as well as the claims. So, Joelle, some individuals have pre-designed action plans for claims, whether it's work comp, auto, GL, which can work amazingly well in their programs. Others, they like to take things one by one and really determine how they're going to transition or what services they're going to use. But they're still extremely proactive, right? Some risk professionals, they really provide, I think, more structure when they're talking to their adjusters, TPA, and brokers, as well as defense attorneys, and they look for guidance that way. Either way, there's no wrong or right answer. It's just the type of work that we do. But in your experience, how have you managed your program and what's your go-to investigation services when you feel that you need some help as you're working your claims?
Well, over the years, right, many different claims, wide array of folks who are from all walks of life filing claims, especially in different industries. That said, when we are sensing that we need a little extra help from any sort of investigation company, my first start point is typically doing a social media check, right? People nowadays, especially in this era of social media, oversharing, et cetera, they often have a way of telling on themselves, or that could be a good thing or a bad thing. Could be confirming suspicions, or it could potentially be confirming, oh yes, this situation they're in. It checks out. So in the past, we have found injuries alleged at work may not be work-related at all. For instance, years ago, I remember early on the claims desk, we had somebody who alleged injuries to bilateral upper extremities due to their workstation, right? We often see ergonomic claims come through. Of course, the employer brought in the ergonomist multiple times. We had a nurse case manager on the file, all of those other service partners and providers were really trying to pull together and make sure that we were getting the individual the care and the resources they needed to get back to baseline. However, problems persisted, and if anything, they worsened every time we got the medical reports back. Sure enough, we conducted a social media check and found out the individual was quite the avid martial artist and frequently traveled for competitions. Of course, it entailed lifting heavy luggage, which very far exceeded the restrictions of no lifting more than 2 pounds. Again, it wasn't the easiest conversation to have, but this person was not represented at the time. So we had to let them know, hey, we understand you've got a lot going on in your life, and let's have an honest discussion with your physicians. And we were able to manage to get the employee back to their baseline, no litigation, which was really surprising. Typically, that does happen at that stage. But, what really helped us was getting that social media check and using our investigative vendors and partners to make that a possibility and help move the claim towards resolution.
Yeah, so much can be seen in social media. I think post COVID, we've really seen that transition, right? That was the only way to connect. Kate, how about you? How do you run your program?
Thanks, Angel. First and foremost, creating relationships with your boots on the ground, regardless of your industry, I think is key for risk managers charged with overseeing claims. As such, I tend to adjust the request for investigation services based off of the input we receive from either our frontline associates at our resorts or our adjusters that are handling our claims. Let's see. Looks like I lost someone here. I'll keep going though.
Yes, keep going.
So on that note, some of the red flags that we receive from our adjusters are through just normal claims handling, such as ISO results. But the tips that we receive from our frontline associates at the resorts have really been game changers in terms of me being able to better direct which type of investigation services to use. A good example of this is, I'll never forget it. We had a workers' comp claim at my prior employer, and it was headed towards a total permanent disability finding. But we received a tip from a coworker that he was working at a nail salon. And so one of our investigators actually went into the nail salon and obtained a pedicure with a hidden camera on. And while we may not be able to get away with some of those type services, depending on the state in the current environment, this was years ago. And what that ultimately led to was the exposure for that file was adjusted by over $400,000. So I think just that's one good example of how listening and having those relationships with your boots on the ground can be beneficial. But I think to my most used investigation type, I think my go-to overall would be 3 days of surveillance on nice weather weekends. And with Frasco in particular, that includes a condensed social media search that the investigator does prior to heading out on the assignment, which in my mind is like a 2-for-1. And Frasco obviously produces results for us in that regard as well.
That's wonderful. Well, first of all, the mitigation, like $400,000, that's a huge amount of money to save. And, I remember even as I was on the risk side, a lot of my colleagues would say, I don't use investigation at all. It's not worth it. It's a cost. But when you're really taking a look at the ROI and you're working, I think one of the key things that you talked about too is working hand in hand with your service partners, right? No matter who it is that you're using, but making sure that the communication line is open, that they understand your program, they understand what you need. So thank you so much for sharing that. So many times we attend conferences or we watch trainings, and they tend to just focus on fraud, which we know can be an issue. But when you're taking a look at that in comparison to the program as a whole, there's a lot of other reasons why we can use investigation services. Even though it seems to be a big focus, as I said, we know it's important, but we want to take a look at the holistic view of a claim. And so things like taking statements from witnesses, taking statements from injured parties, confirming that an injury actually happened, and obtaining background information, especially when you're talking about general liability, auto, or premises claims where we don't really know who we're talking about. Joelle, for you, it could be some of the guests that are attending some of the games. Cade, for you, it could be your guests staying at the hotels or at the premises, right? So outside of pushing fraud, Cade, how do you utilize investigation services in your program to mitigate the large costs? And I know that you did mention, surveillance, but anything specific that comes to mind when you're talking about maybe general liability or premises?
Yeah, I think overall, um, we toss around the word fraud a little too often in the industry. More so, where investigation services come into play for me as a risk manager is it helps me work with our TPAs and our carriers to better evaluate the type of exposure we have ahead of negotiations, whether it's mediation or um, negotiations outside of mediations. But it also helps us enable the claimant a lot of times to, we want to set the stage for them. And I think if we can share some of that information beforehand, then it enables us to have the claimant come to the negotiating table with realistic demands and expectations. Whereas otherwise, it would be difficult for us to settle a claim if we share, not our full hand, but a couple of the cards. Then it tends to be a game changer and set up both sides for a more successful day at the negotiation table. So I think just learning more about the claimant's lifestyle, habits, capabilities. It can also, in some circumstances, we can provide that information to a doctor for context around their medical opinions. So there's just all kinds of different ways we can use it, but overall, it helps us better evaluate the claim and set up negotiations for success.
Being a risk manager can be really different at each company. And I think if you're not in the industry, sometimes people don't recognize that. But when you are in the industry, we know that some manage only work comp programs, others, they're taking on, all lines of business. Some are putting together the programs and the annual, working directly with brokers. Again, some of our risk managers are maybe statewide, national, global, and they may be taking a look at their work comp, their general liability, their premises, cargo, you name it. Joelle, how important is investigation in your GL and property programs? And since there are claims that maybe, again, you don't know the person who's filing, how do you utilize different services and how do you really, pack a punch to mitigate some of that cost for your companies?
So yeah, again, right, like using social media, obtaining statements, etc., super helpful here, right? Because we don't often know about a lot of the folks, especially if you have a claim that's brought forward by a customer who may file a general liability claim. They may not necessarily be able to share who they are or paint that entire picture with the adjuster when they're obtaining statements. We're also often at the mercy of the incident reports, which, on one end, we certainly work to train individuals to write robust reports and statements. However, that doesn't always fully depict who the claimant is, what their life is like. Again, alluding back to what Cade said, just understanding their habits and the way they go about their lives and how they live. So oftentimes obtaining, whether it's surveillance or social media checks, we definitely see an ROI there, especially if we are looking at a super high exposure claim. And let's say, the claimant's indicating that they are completely, totally disabled due to the incident that took place on site. Of course, the the receipts via social media and or footage could tell us otherwise, and that of course is what we use as leverage for overall settling or at least moving these claims toward resolution. Oftentimes we think, again, right, surveillance is so expensive, and like, to echo what you mentioned in your experience as well, Angel, a lot of risk managers probably feel like they're averse to actually using those services, just because, let's face it, oftentimes we have investigators who might sit around for hours and not get anything. That all said, one way to actually help mitigate, wasting your dollars and everyone else's time is to have a good plan with your claims adjuster, with your investigative partners, et cetera, just so you folks know what your thresholds are. Don't burn a full day's worth of Sabrosa on, something that might not actually lead to any sort of good findings. If someone's out of town, tell them to stop the investigation for the day and come back to it another day when there's a probability of having better findings. Overall, though, again, just to reiterate, this really does help us understand our overall exposures and help mitigate the exposures by creating some sort of leverage to move our claims towards resolution, especially if we don't have any sort of personal relationship or any working relationship with some of the claimants who may bring something against any of your organizations.
All great points. And one of the things that, I like to point out is jurisdictionally, every state is different. And, many of the states, they will not even utilize what I call home investigations, right? So if your claims adjuster, the TPA, or even an employer is doing an investigation on social media themselves, I remember once having a safety manager send me a video and they were like, "Oh, look what we found, an injured employee out at the grocery store." And although it could feel like, hey, we're doing our, due diligence and we're doing our own investigation, it really can impede it at the end of the day because, one, jurisdictionally, if you're doing your own investigation, it may not even be accepted into trial, right? And two, if the person who is involved in that claim, whether they be an employee or, a party to the claim, if they start to see your company or an insurance company poke around in their social media, that could be a red flag, and you can see additional claims start getting added of harassment, things like that. So when we talk about investigation, I think also knowing that post-investigation is an option for many of companies out there. What can happen is if you have impactful surveillance, impactful background, you may have sent out those reports over to not your attorney, but to the doctor's office, and they say, we didn't receive it, or, it takes 2 weeks for them to respond, or maybe they never review it. But working with the service partner that you have, asking them to make an appointment with the doctor, go out, have an investigator sit and show the surveillance, show all of the positive, impactful results that have been received, and then start asking the doctor, how does that pertain to the claim? Is this what they told you? Does it review? That can also have a big impact in mitigation. So, as we're coming to a close, I would love to have you provide some guidance to some of our peers out there who may be watching or watch the recording. Joelle, what's your top 1 or 2 pearls of wisdom on investigation and program?
So I have two. So first and foremost, and I think, I can't drive this home enough, documentation is your friend. If it's not in writing or at least memorialized in some way, shape, or form, then it didn't happen, right? Witness statements are incredibly important, incident reports, video, etc. That is something that we may not always get up front. So that's where you can bring in those partners, your trusted vendors, and get that investigation you may need, be it a witness statement, be it surveillance, or be it social media checks. And with that, second point is make sure that you're assembling your team. That's you, your adjuster, your trusted vendors and partners, make sure you folks are on the same page and have a very clear laid out plan for your investigation efforts so that you can indeed max out that the services that you're entrusting your vendor partners to provide to you. And hopefully that will lead to overall savings and just a better outcome for the claim. And, not just for the organization you're working for, but for all parties involved.
Great point. Love that. Cade, if you're mentoring a new risk professional, what would you tell them is important to know about working with service partners or how to utilize investigation to really impact their program?
From a service partner perspective, the best guidance I can give is just understand, like most products and services, you get what you pay for in this industry. And that's not to say that you don't want to find someone who can provide competitive pricing for those services, but you really need to find a vendor that produces results. And I just can attest that some of the lower cost providers I've used in the past did not produce those results. And so just be willing to pay a little more for a vendor that is producing for you. And then I think just overall, I'll go back to some advice I alluded to earlier in the conversation, and that's for risk managers in general, you want to establish relationships with your boots on the ground and operations level associates and leaders. And that will help you not only in investigations, but really with your core business objectives as a risk manager.
Yeah, it could be really hard for risk professionals to determine, what is the ROI on what our spend is, or even what is our spend. I have talked to so many colleagues and they're like, we don't even know what our annual spend is. And we can't get that from, a TPA or a service partner. So when you're determining who you're working with, ask some questions. Maybe ask, are there quarterly stewardship reports that you could provide us where you can keep a more transparent and visual on it. Thank you to our viewers for joining us today. I'm so excited. I want to thank Cade and Joelle for giving the viewers some great information to our LinkedIn community. Again, thank you for watching. And until next time, we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.